The first thing the woman said after dropping into the empty seat beside me was, "You're my husband for the next 3 hours." Before I could decide whether she was joking, she slipped a plain silver ring onto her finger, gripped my arm with a trembling hand, and stared past me toward the train platform as if someone outside had followed her all the way to the carriage. Her face was pale beneath the bright morning sunlight pouring through the window, and there was a desperate warning in her eyes that made every question in my mind disappear. A tall man in a charcoal coat stood beside the station clock, scanning the windows one by one, his jaw tight with anger. When his gaze reached our carriage, the woman leaned closer and rested her head against my shoulder. I felt her shaking. That was when I understood that she had not chosen me because I looked kind or trustworthy. She had chosen me because she was frightened, out of time, and needed a stranger to become the safest person in her world. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances. Sometimes a person's entire life can change because someone decides not to look away. My name was Everett Cole, and until that morning, I had spent almost 2 years doing exactly that, looking away from anything that might require courage. I was 37, recently divorced, and traveling from Boston to Portland to sign the final papers selling my late father's cabin. The cabin had been the last place my father and I spoke before his death, and our final conversation had ended with harsh words neither of us had been given time to take back. Since then, I had convinced myself that closing doors was the same as healing. The woman beside me seemed to sense that I was not naturally brave, yet she held on anyway. She quietly told me her name was Maren and asked me to smile at her as the man in the charcoal coat boarded the train. I forced my mouth into something that probably looked more like pain than affection, but it was enough. The man stopped in the aisle when he saw us. His name, Maren whispered, was Curtis Vale. He had once been her fiancé. For months after their engagement ended, he had appeared outside her workplace, called from unknown numbers, and sent messages that alternated between apologies and threats. That morning, Maren was traveling to a family court hearing in Portland to support her younger sister, who was fighting for custody of her 6-year-old son. Curtis had learned about the trip and had come to the station demanding that Maren speak with him. She had boarded the first train she could, only to see him purchase a ticket moments before departure. She did not want a confrontation. She wanted to reach Portland safely. When Curtis stood beside our seats and asked Maren who I was, she tightened her hand around mine and said, with a steadiness I knew she did not feel, that I was her husband. Curtis studied me with the cold patience of a man deciding whether another person was worth the trouble. I told him Maren and I were on our way to visit family. He asked when we had married, where we lived, and why he had never heard of me. Each question came wrapped in a smile that never reached his eyes. I answered with details pulled from the life I had lost. I said we had married beside a lake in Vermont because Maren hated crowded rooms. I said she drank coffee with too much cinnamon and stole the blankets even during summer. I said we lived in a narrow brick house with a maple tree outside the kitchen window. Those details had belonged to my marriage with my former wife, Claire, and speaking them aloud felt like opening a sealed room inside my chest. Maren glanced at me as if she could hear the truth beneath the lies. Curtis finally stepped back, but before moving down the aisle, he leaned close enough for us both to hear him warn Maren that 3 hours was a long time to pretend. The train began moving beneath a brilliant blue morning sky, carrying us away from the station while Curtis took a seat several rows behind us. Maren released a breath that sounded as though she had been holding it for years. She apologized for dragging me into her life. I told her it was fine, although neither of us believed it. Through the reflection in the window, I could see Curtis watching us. For the first 40 minutes, Maren and I performed the quiet habits of a married couple. She rested her hand on mine. I showed her photographs on my phone. We shared a paper cup of coffee from the dining car. But beneath that performance, something real and painful began to surface. In one photograph, she noticed the cabin I was going to sell. When she asked about it, I told her my father had built it with his own hands and that I had not visited since the day we argued. I expected her to leave the subject alone. Instead, she said fear could make people run from places they still loved. Maren knew something about running. She had spent 4 years engaged to Curtis, slowly surrendering pieces of herself to keep peace between them. At first, he had only criticized small things, the way she laughed too loudly, the friends she saw too often, the dresses he thought drew attention. Later, he controlled her money, monitored her phone, and convinced her that every disagreement proved she was unstable. She had stayed because her mother had been ill, her sister was trapped in a difficult marriage, and Maren believed leaving would make her another problem the family could not afford. The turning point came one bright afternoon when her nephew, Toby, visited her apartment and accidentally spilled juice across the carpet. Curtis shouted so violently that the little boy hid behind Maren and whispered that he was sorry for making the bad man angry. Maren ended the engagement the next morning. Curtis never struck her, but he had made her afraid of her own voice, and she knew fear did not need bruises to become abuse. As she told me this, she kept her eyes fixed on the passing fields, where sunlight flashed across patches of late spring water. I realized she was not merely traveling to support her sister. She was going to testify about a pattern of intimidation connecting Curtis to her sister's husband, a longtime friend of his. Her statement could help her sister gain temporary custody and a protective order. Curtis wanted her to miss the hearing. He had followed her not because he wanted reconciliation, but because silence had always been the power he held over her. I asked why she had not contacted the police at the station. She said she had tried before, but Curtis was skilled at appearing calm while making her seem emotional. Her voice broke when she admitted that a part of her still feared no one would believe her. I looked back at Curtis and saw him smiling at a train attendant as though he were the most reasonable man in the world. Then I understood the true danger. Maren was not only afraid of what he might do. She was afraid he would persuade everyone else that he had done nothing. At the next stop, Curtis rose from his seat and walked toward us. The train had paused beneath the clear light of late morning, and passengers were moving through the aisle with bags and cups of coffee. Curtis calmly announced that Maren's sister had called and said the hearing had been postponed. Maren reached for her phone, but there was no signal inside the carriage. Curtis offered to show her the message if she followed him onto the platform. For one terrible second, uncertainty crossed her face. Years of manipulation had trained her to doubt her own judgment faster than she doubted his. I told Curtis that we would verify the information ourselves. His expression hardened. He accused me of interfering in something I did not understand and told Maren that she was humiliating herself by clinging to a stranger. Several passengers turned toward us. Curtis immediately softened his tone and said he was only worried about her. I could see the old trap closing around her, the calm voice, the concerned face, the suggestion that she was confused. Maren's fingers loosened from mine. She stared down at the silver ring, breathing quickly. I wanted to confront Curtis, but anger would have given him exactly what he needed. So I did the only thing I could think of. I asked Maren to tell me the name of the maple tree outside our imaginary kitchen window. She looked at me, confused. I reminded her of our fictional wedding by the lake and the cinnamon in her coffee. Then I quietly told her that none of those details were real, but the choice in front of her was. She could follow the man who had spent years teaching her not to trust herself, or she could remain in a crowded carriage where dozens of people could see and hear her. Maren lifted her head. Her fear did not vanish, but something stronger rose beside it. She told Curtis she was staying on the train. He reached for her wrist. I stood between them, and this time other passengers stood too. A retired teacher named Beatrice Lang pressed the emergency call button while a college student began recording the encounter on his phone. The conductor arrived with a transit officer, and suddenly Curtis could no longer control the story. He claimed Maren was his unstable former partner and that I had manipulated her. Maren's face went white, but she did not retreat. With her voice shaking, she showed the officer months of saved messages, photographs of Curtis outside her workplace, and a voicemail in which he warned that her sister would lose everything if Maren testified. The transit officer listened carefully. Curtis was escorted off the train at the station while arrangements were made for local authorities to question him. As he disappeared through the doors, he looked back at Maren with a fury that once might have silenced her. This time, she stared directly at him. When the train began moving again, the entire carriage seemed to breathe with her. Beatrice sat across from us and told Maren that courage was not the absence of trembling, it was telling the truth while your hands still shook. Maren began to cry, not the quiet, embarrassed tears of someone trying to remain invisible, but the deep tears of a person finally allowing herself to believe she had survived. I sat beside her without pretending to be her husband anymore. I was simply a stranger holding her hand in the sunlight. Yet somehow that felt more honest and intimate than anything I had experienced in years. With Curtis gone, Maren contacted her sister and learned the hearing had not been postponed. In fact, the judge had delayed the start by 30 minutes because of a scheduling conflict, giving Maren just enough time to arrive. Relief washed over her, but mine was replaced by a familiar heaviness as Portland drew closer. I told her I planned to sign the cabin sale papers that afternoon and return to Boston before evening. Maren asked why I was selling it. I said the property carried too much guilt. My father and I had argued because he refused to leave the cabin after a heart condition made living alone unsafe. I had accused him of caring more about the building than his family. He had accused me of abandoning every relationship that became difficult. I drove away angry. 2 days later, he died while sitting on the porch in the daylight, looking over the lake. I had spent years believing my final words had proved him right. Maren listened without offering easy comfort. Then she asked whether selling the cabin was an act of healing or another form of abandonment. The question struck harder than anything Curtis had said. She reminded me that guilt often disguises itself as punishment, convincing us that destroying what remains will somehow repay what was lost. My father could not hear an apology now, but I could still choose what his life taught me. I thought of Claire, my former wife, who had begged me to attend counseling before our divorce. I had refused because admitting I was afraid had seemed more humiliating than losing her. I thought of friends whose calls I had stopped answering and of the cabin waiting beneath the sun, full of dust, tools, and unfinished memories. For the first time, I saw that I had not been moving forward. I had simply become talented at leaving. When the train reached Portland shortly after noon, Maren and I stepped onto the platform together. The entire journey had lasted almost exactly 3 hours, yet it felt as though we had crossed years of buried pain. A court advocate met Maren near the station entrance, along with her sister, Laurel, and Toby. The boy ran into Maren's arms, and she held him so tightly that his shoes lifted from the ground. Laurel thanked me through tears, though I told her Maren had saved herself. Before leaving for the courthouse, Maren removed the silver ring and placed it in my palm. She had carried it since ending her engagement, not as a memory of love but as proof that she had once escaped. She said she no longer needed it. I closed her fingers around it and told her to keep it for a different reason as proof that fear had followed her onto a train and she had still reached her destination. She smiled, then asked what I would do about the cabin. I looked toward the station windows, where the afternoon sunlight reflected the shape of a man who seemed both familiar and changed. I called the real estate attorney and canceled the sale. Then I called Claire. I did not ask her to take me back. I simply apologized for every time I had punished her with silence and admitted that she had deserved a husband willing to face difficult things. Claire was quiet for a long moment. She said she had waited years to hear that apology, not because it would repair the marriage, but because she needed to know the man she once loved had finally understood what he had done. We forgave each other without pretending the past could be rewritten. 3 months later, on a bright summer afternoon, I reopened my father's cabin as a free weekend retreat for families rebuilding their lives after domestic abuse. Beatrice helped organize donated books, Laurel managed the small garden, and Toby painted a crooked wooden sign that read, "A safe place to begin again." Maren became an advocate for survivors navigating the court system, using the voice Curtis had once convinced her was worthless. The charges against him moved slowly, but she no longer measured freedom by whether he was punished. She measured it by the fact that she could wake each morning without asking permission to exist. On the first day the retreat opened, Maren arrived by train carrying the same silver ring on a chain around her neck. We stood on the cabin porch beneath the clear afternoon sky, looking over the lake where my father had spent his final hours. I told her I still wished I could change my last conversation with him. She reminded me that redemption was not changing the last page, it was deciding what story came after it. We did not become a perfect couple overnight, and neither of us needed another performance. We became friends first, then something quieter and stronger, built from truth rather than rescue. A year after the train ride, we married beside the lake in a small daytime ceremony. There was cinnamon in the coffee, a maple sapling beside the kitchen window, and no need to invent a single detail. Before this story ends, leave a meaningful comment about the person who helped you trust yourself again, or share what forgiveness and courage mean in your own life. Your words may become the hope someone else needs today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Maren had sat beside me asking for a husband for 3 hours, but what she truly needed was one person willing to believe her. I thought I had saved her from a frightening train ride, yet she had saved me from a lifetime of running. Sometimes love does not arrive with promises, flowers, or perfect timing. Sometimes it sits beside you in a crowded carriage, trembling but determined, and asks you to become brave before you believe you are capable of it.